Okay, thanks for coming along, guys. We're very lucky this morning to have Dr. Ben Habib to talk to us about environmental movements. Ben is an expert not only in nuclear proliferation and particularly around issues in North Korea, but he's also been researching climate change and the politics of climate change, but more importantly for our purposes, the various ways in which global environmental movements have sort of formed and coalesced and then branched off into different areas. So Ben is going to be talking to us about these different movements and a little bit of history, but also some of the kind of really interesting approaches today and the ways in which some of these movements have become really important sort of grassroots efforts at social and cultural change. So thank you very much, Ben, and enjoy, and I'll see you guys in tutorials.
Cheers. Thanks, Kamuda. I'll start with a quick shout out to the IR law students who will be listening to this online and commiserate with you for having to attend a constitutional law lecture instead of coming to this, because this is going to be far more interesting. And you will be the beneficiaries of this trade. All right, we're going to look at environment movements today. I've got the breakdown of how we're going to structure up the session here. So I want to start off by looking at environmental movements as a plural, that there's many different environmentalisms, and that these environmentalisms kind of shape together as a complex ecology, and I'll flesh out that idea in a bit more detail. Then we'll look at the historic phases of the environmental movements dating back to the 19th century to kind of set the contextual scene of where we're at now. And then we'll do a social movement analysis of environmentalisms using a methodology developed by a couple of social movement theorists to flesh out what the movement actually looks like, how it's constructed, and what its features are, and including its political impacts. And this methodology is something that you can apply to any of the social movements that you've looked at. And I know Kamuda has drawn on these theorists and these methods in previous lectures. So what, do you usually have a break halfway, or do you power through for 2 hours? There is a break? Yeah, cool. All right, well, we'll see how we go. I might nudge a little bit long with what I have to say, but then we'll do something participatory in the second half. So let's see how we go. So let's get to this idea of many environmentalisms. Why do you think there's so many different facets of the environmental movements? Why are there more than one movement within this broad umbrella of environmentalism? What do you think? Yeah.
There are lots of different issues.
Yeah.
And there are lots of different perspectives on environmentalism, because it means different things to different people.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you can see on the side of the slide here, issue is the thing at the top. So what kind of issues would fall under the banner of environmentalism? Would be environmental concerns. Yeah.
Deforestation.
Yep, very important one. What else? Just throw it out there, quick brainstorm. Yeah,
Rising sea levels.
yeah. And climate change more broadly, for sure. Anything else? Yep. Yep, absolutely. But if you even think of pre-climate change, nuclear power, there's a huge sub-movement within environmentalism about that, or the anti-nuclear movement. There's stuff about localised chemical and industrial pollution. There's stuff related to genetically modified organisms, particularly in the food system. There's associated movements related to social justice, anti-war movements, movements related to international trade. There's lots of issue linkage across other social justice movements that feed into what's happening in environmentalism. And it depends on where you are, where you live, and local contexts and local problems. It depends on what scale you're looking at. So if I live next door to a chemical factory that's dumping toxins into the river, that's at local scale. if we're thinking of climate change and greenhouse gas pollution, that's at global scale. So there's different issues at different scales, but those scales are interlinked. It depends on the classes, social class of the people involved, and economic hierarchies and disparities. Ethnicity plays a role in there, as well as gender, and there's First Nations issues. So if we think of all of the intersecting variables of empowerment and disempowerment that impact any one person's relative power in relation to the structures in their society that they live in, that's going to impact how they experience the environment and how they experience environmental problems. And it's also going to shape their capacity to have political agency in responding to these issues. Now, this idea of social movements as an ecology, so we've just mapped out there's lots of different environmentalisms. There's lots of different ways of thinking about the environment, so different environmental discourses. We'll get to that later. Which means there's lots of individuals and there's lots of groups and there's lots of networks of groups and people at different scales. And they all play a role within this broader environmental movement. What do you think they have in common? Just have a stab, it's all good.
Care for the environment in one way or another.
Yeah.
Maybe wanting to look after it.
Yeah, so there's that definite common ground of care for the environment and wanting to make the earth sustainable. Now, how you interpret sustainability, that's another thing. Right?
The environmental protection and focusing on the changing of the environment.
Yes. Yeah. So environmental protection, looking at how the environment changes, but there's different interpretations of what to do about those problems, and there's different interpretations about how to go about that. And so your standard political spectrum, it's possible to be a right-wing environmentalist or a left-wing environmentalist. Environmentalism and sustainability cuts across the left-right spectrum. It's a different axis. So when you hear some commentators who describe climate change as a left-wing issue, well, they're dead wrong, because the environment impacts on everyone, and you just can't interpret the environment from the perspective of the left-right spectrum. It doesn't work that way. So let's now have a look at the historic phases of environmentalism in the West. And I'm positioning this looking at the West and the Anglosphere, because environmentalisms in the developing world are coming from a different starting point and a different place. And we need to bear that in mind when we look at this topic. So let's rewind back to industrial England in the 19th century and the beautiful cityscapes that we're looking at on the slide here. Now, why is there so much air pollution in 19th century English industrial cities?
Is it just because all the industries burn dirty fuel?
Yeah. So they're using coal. People in houses are using just coal briquettes for heating. So think of the smoke and stuff that comes out of doing that. And this is the opening phase of industrialisation. So there's no regulations, there's no environmental laws or anything like that. Those things came because people got sick of living in places like this and started agitating and mobilising around doing something about it. This is new. You never saw anything like this prior to the Industrial Revolution. This kind of air pollution is a direct result of the burning of fossil fuels and industrial processes. The air pollution is a byproduct. And because all of these factories and stuff were concentrated in these industrial cities, that concentrated where the air pollution was happening. And you got these cityscapes. So what do you think of the health impacts of living in a situation like this? Yeah. So just think, if you've got asthma or anything now, imagine living somewhere like this. People die much quicker than they otherwise would because they have to live in polluted environments like this. Now, what about this pig here? Do you know where that is? In the bottom corner. This is a photo that I took actually a few years ago. This is in Beijing. And lo and behold, we've got the same kind of pollution problems here. So in the mega cities around the world now, where you're seeing this kind of air pollution, they're at a level of industrialisation. Newly industrialised, don't have the politics and the legal regimes and regulations in place to do something about this. And so environmental politics in these places now kind of in a similar place to where European and North American cities were 150 years ago, in starting to respond to these byproducts of the industrial process. If we fast forward to the immediate post-World War II period, and you start to see some new trends and ideas creeping into environmental discourses, and this idea of preservationism versus conservationism. So if we think about, particularly in Western Europe at this time, you've got landscapes that are completely destroyed by 2 world wars within 30 years. And so there is a trend to start thinking about, hey, how do we preserve the ecosystems that we've got? How can we keep them intact? And so preservationism, coming from that context, is how can we preserve these ecosystems in place and keep humans out of them so that they can survive and regenerate. And that's opposed to this view of conservationism, which is about how can we preserve natural landscapes but also use them to get some economic benefit out of them. And this is an idea that started to pop up in the United States. And the national park system that was established there comes from that tradition. So natural spaces, not just as virgin landscapes that humans have to stay out of, but landscapes that humans can use and can benefit from in some way. So any questions so far? Yeah. If you've got a question or you want something clarified, just yell out and I'll be happy to address. In this period during the 1960s, sometimes in a given issue area, there's one book or one study or one person that puts out something that has a seismic impact on the field. And in environmental politics, it was this book, Silent Spring, written by Rachel Carson, that is like this is the seminal text that sparked off contemporary environmentalism as we know it today. Now, this book was about the impact of chemicals on ecosystems. And it's called Silent Spring because the argument that Carson was making here was that the liberal use of toxic chemicals was killing off populations of birds in the United States. And come springtime, the name of the book here, it's silent because the birds weren't there to be chirping. So anyone in the environmental movement or with environmental consciousness who's perhaps a bit older than me, maybe of the baby boomer era, they will always say reading this book changed the goalposts of their thinking because no one had talked about the environment this way and no one had framed the impact of toxic pollutants in this kind of way before. This book's in the library. It's well worth a read because it's such a seminal text in environmentalism. But have you ever seen this footage of companies like Monsanto and others sort of bathing people in DDT saying, oh, it's safe, it's awesome? And now, that would be highly illegal because this is a highly toxic substance. But back then, these chemicals were still relatively new. And they were used far and wide. Interestingly now, although chemicals like DDT and others are banned in a lot of Western countries, these big chemical corporations can still make and export these products to developing countries where there aren't environmental regulations. So that's an issue of unequal distribution of environmental regulation around the world that kind of mirrors patterns of development and socioeconomic hierarchies across the international system. We have Silent Spring. There was another really important event, not about environmentalism per se, but something that changed how humans thought of their place in relation to everything around us. And this was the Apollo missions to the moon. And the pictures that came back, the first pictures ever that were taken of the Earth from outside of the Earth, seeing the Earth as this single finite entity. And for a lot of people, this had a really profound impact of how they viewed their relationship to everything else, and being able to actually, for the first time, conceptualise that the Earth is this finite entity, and there's not unlimited resources, there's not unlimited pollution sinks, and that we're all in this thing together. It was a profound ontological shift that impacted a lot of people. I mean, what's your reaction when you see this photo? Yeah, when you take a cosmic view of the Earth and our place in it, you know, we're part of this massive universe, and this tiny, small rock with some water and breathable gases on it in this vast vacuum of space. You know, it changes how you think about what we're doing here. And it is important to engage emotionally with the content that we're doing. You know, some of you will have heard me talk about this before, but human decision making is not generally rational. It's emotion based. So, you know, imagery that changes how you view yourself and how you view others and your relationships to place can be very powerful. And it's particularly so in the environmental movement, because relationship to place is such an important part of what this movement's about. So during this period, we have the limits to growth discourse. And around the same time, we have another one of these seminal works of environmentalism, this study commissioned by the Club of Rome called Limits to Growth, written by Danello and Dennis Meadows and Jorgen Randers, which for the first time used some complex systems thinking to map out the idea that if we continue on the trajectories of industrialisation and resource consumption, that humanity's going to hit a wall and there could be some form of collapse because we are hitting the natural finite limits of the Earth system that we're living in. And this was another one of these seismic documents saying we've got a problem which is looming in the next 20 to 30 years, and we need to do something about this. And also at this time you've got the oil shocks, which are pushing up the price of oil, which is having ripple effects through economies around the world at that time. So resource constraints are starting to, there's a tangible thing that people are resonating with because of these resource constraints. And that, if you shape all of these things together, there's a very powerful message that there's a looming crisis coming for humanity if something's not done to curb the more voracious appetites of industrial societies. And so through the 1980s to about the year 2000, governments start engaging with this idea. And you get this idea of sustainable development. Now, the classic definition of sustainability was advanced by this woman here, Gro Harlem Brundtland, who was the Prime Minister of Norway and also was the lead author of a report put out by the UN. And in this report, they define sustainability as meeting the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And that's kind of the classic definition of sustainability that's stayed with us ever since. Now, what's your first impression of this definition of sustainability? Yeah.
Very human-centric.
Yes, definitely human-centric. What else strikes you about it?
Yeah, similar lines. It doesn't focus on preserving the environment because it's the environment. It's the environment for the sake of humans.
Yeah, definitely. It's the environment as it is a resource for human activity. And it's also very vague, isn't it? So,
Idealistic.
sorry?
It's like idealistic.
Yeah, that's right. It is very idealistic. And that's why this definition stayed on board, because it was quite revolutionary for its time. But within it, you can see this idea of trying to do environmental protection and economic development, to have your cake and eat it too. And this has been critiqued as highly problematic because industrial activities, any kind of economic activity, necessarily consumes resources and necessarily has some kind of environmental or pollution footprint. That's just inescapable. Even individual human beings, just by being alive, we consume resources and we have a footprint just through our natural processes, even, let alone our lifestyle choices. So it's how do you manage that? For governments, can you imagine governments just out of the blue legislating policies based on limits to growth and saying we have to limit our economies, we can't keep growing? Think of all the political capital that's invested in promoting economic growth. Every politician from major parties, that's the number one thing that they'll talk about, is how can we grow the economy, how can we do more jobs, etc., etc. So that's a really big hurdle for governments to overcome if they're looking to do environmental protection. So you can see how sustainable development is a discourse that tries to mould those two imperatives into one thing. And this is the discourse that has shaped all of the big multilateral environmental conferences and all of the environmental organisations that have stemmed from them. So think of the 1992, we had the Rio Earth Conference in Rio de Janeiro. And that was the first time that you had leaders from almost all countries on the planet get together to meet to discuss environmental issues and the environment. So it's quite extraordinary. And from that time, you had a number of the key international environmental treaties that we know now, like the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the Convention to Combat Desertification. So those three are known as the Rio Conventions. They're three of the most important environmental treaties now, and they were opened for signing at the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. And you know who that guy is there? Yeah, so that's Bob Brown, former leader of the Greens here, and he came to prominence in the Franklin Dam protests in the 1980s in Tasmania as an environmental activist, and he built his career on the back of that. So that's the modern Greens movement as we know it today, that's expressed itself in Greens parties and Greens politics in democracies around the Western world. Those movements had their genesis in the 1980s when environmental activists decided to start organising into political wings and to try and influence institutional politics based around environmental political platforms. But if we get to now, we're in an interesting new phase where we're seeing an emerging post-carbon era starting to take shape. We're starting to see a transition from fossil fuel energy to a basket of different renewable energy sources. And that transition is part government policy, it's part social activism from grassroots movements like the ones we're looking at here, and it's also part market economics. that now the cost of producing energy through renewables is on par with coal and other sources. So this transition is accelerating now, and although it's not always obvious to see this in Australia, the post-carbon energy transition is now unstoppable, and it's going to continue accelerating around the world. So the theme we can see here is that the phases of environmentalism in the West have followed the arc of industrialisation. Industrial development has created environmental harms, which grassroots actors have responded to. And you've seen incremental increases in environmental awareness, in environmental regulation, and industry responses to that over the arc of this time. Environmentalisms in newly developed and developing countries are grappling with different issues. They're at different places on this arc of industrialisation, as well as grappling with issues related to the intersection of socioeconomic hierarchy, issues to do with race and post-colonialism and other issues like that. So we've got to really be clear that there's a lot of, if we look at this ecology of environmentalisms, there's a lot of factors that shape what these environmentalisms look like in any one location. So the global context of this current moment now is a broader sustainability transition. So the energy system transition is one part of this global sustainability transition. So if we think of sustainability transition, what comes to mind? What do you think this process is about? And there's a visual clue up there. Have a go.
Zero emissions?
Yeah, that's one part of it for sure.
Happy Earth?
Well, hopefully a happy Earth. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, if we look at these two graphics here, an ecosystem, an earth system, a society, an economic system that's out of balance and environmentally destructive, to one where all of those systems are in balance. And key here is, what we're defining as sustainability and what it means to be sustainable. Yeah.
Do you think that population is sort of one of the main issues moving forward, or in the future?
That's a really interesting question. And population is such a fraught topic to bring up in environmental debates because it depends where you are. And it's so loaded with, a lot of language related to racism and debates around immigration and things like that. So if everyone in the world wants to aspire to live like we do here, we're fucked, in shorthand, because the environmental footprint of people who live in developed countries like Australia or the United States, etc., there's just not enough resources on the planet to be able to cater for 8 or 9 billion people living that lifestyle. It's just physically not possible. And there's not the pollution sink, like our ecosystems cannot absorb all of the waste products from people living that kind of lifestyle. But if we look to other parts of the world, people are living with vastly lower environmental footprints. So if we lived with the environmental footprint of someone who lives in India, or someone who lives in Kenya, or even someone who lives in China, per capita environmental footprint is very small in places like that, although in China it's starting to rise. So if we're living those kinds of lifestyles, then we can support more people on the planet. So it's all about the carrying capacity of the ecosystems that we live in. We forget that our human societies, our economies, our social and political systems, all of these things here are dependent on the environment. We are wholly dependent on the natural environment because we're piggybacking on this planet Earth, and everything we need for our subsistence and survival comes from the Earth. So if we move beyond what the Earth can sustain in terms of its carrying capacity, then by definition, like, we need to pull back. Or there's going, like the Malthusian argument, is that the Earth will do depopulation for us through famine, pestilence, big environmental disasters, etc. So there's kind of an imperative for us to pull back and try and aim for something like this. So from that perspective, what does it mean to be sustainable then? This is like the key question of environmentalism. Yeah.
Do more with less?
Yeah. But in what context?
Consumption and how we sort of use fuels.
Yep. Yeah. And that relates to our carrying capacity. So if we're using more than the Earth's ecosystems can regenerate in any one year, then that's not sustainable. Saying we're doing something sustainably, like, that doesn't matter if we're still using more than what the Earth can regenerate through its natural processes. So that's what the sustainability transition is all about. Transitioning from where we are here, where we're clearly overstepping the Earth's carrying capacity, scaling back how we structure and run our society to a level where we're not taking more from the Earth than what the Earth can regenerate. And in so doing, we're not undercutting our means of subsistence. We're not robbing from the future in order to subsidise our production, consumption and exchange patterns of the present. And that's really important. So if we think about this sustainability process, getting to that point, what does that mean for the economy, for how we structure our economies? What kind of economic systems do we have? How do we do production and consumption and exchange of goods and services? The economy is one of the primary means by which human beings interact with the environment. Because all economic activity, as I said, involves resource consumption and generation of wastes. So we need to change how we run the economy. Technology is a big part of that. So what kind of technologies are going to be able to help us to meet this goal of true sustainability? And renewable energies are a part of that. Are there any other technologies that you can think of that would fall into this category? So think of all of the raft of green technologies. What have you come across? Yep.
Things to do like carbon capture and stuff?
Yeah, the best carbon capture technology are trees and plants.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. There probably is a place for technologies that can accelerate what's available. But I would argue that reforestation is the best means of doing that. But there are other technologies like waste to energy transfer. So if you've got urban waste, you take it to one of these facilities where they crush it all up, put all of the waste in a big incinerator, burning of which generates gas, which is then burned to power a turbine, which generates electricity, and the ash waste products are used for stuff like roads and things like that. The water that comes out of these wastes are treated and then used to water farmland in the surrounding areas. Australia has nothing remotely like this, but it's now on the cards because China's not taking our recycling anymore. But if you go to China, they've got these technologies. South Korea and Japan have got these technologies. European countries have got these technologies. So it's that kind of thing's coming to Australia soon. Any other technologies that might fall under here?
A little bit of an obscure one, which is sort of
Yeah, but with the idea that you're not taking up a big land space to do that, meat and cows and livestock generate up to a quarter of greenhouse gas emissions globally through methane. So that's one argument for doing that. Of course, the purists are not going to go for a lab-grown burger, but, societies evolve and needs evolve, and that might be something that's a bit more ubiquitous in the future. Governance. So how we govern our social systems. And this doesn't just mean national governments and local governments. It's how do we put together rules and institutions to organise ourselves right from the very local level all the way up to the international level. What kinds of governance models are going to be most appropriate to facilitate this trend, this sustainability transition? Yeah.
I thought the climate tax was a very good idea.
Yeah, and that's part of the mix. What kind of governance model is going to be able to bring into place those kinds of legislative ideas that are going to be able to facilitate these other changes? Is it going to be a democratic system? So there's a lot of arguments in favour of democratisation and giving people a stake in how they govern themselves that increases the resilience of a system and the ability to respond to environmental shocks. There's another school of thought that actually you need green authoritarianism. If you want to get stuff done quickly and respond to this ticking clock of environmental degradation, that you need strong governments that can move quickly and mobilise resources in a hurry. And that would be like the Chinese argument here. But if you're thinking about governance just think of the groupings and organisations that you're part of in your own life. Authoritarian models don't inspire particular confidence in the workplace. Have you ever worked in a democratic workplace? No. So think about this. The only democracy we have here is often the ones we vote in our political structures. But if you think about the other organisations that we're a part of in our lives, be it the workplace, be it social organisations, etc., they're run on more hierarchical authoritarian models. So a true democracy has democratic process, at every level of society, not just in its formal politics. And that is something, the form of government we use into the future is going to be a big part of this debate about sustainability transition. Culture. How does culture fit into this sustainability transition? Yeah.
Kind of goes to the idea of consumption over serving, reusing, whatever else people like things opposed to culturally good to provide the environment or whatever else, kind of part of the way we live our lives as opposed to being
Yeah. So what are these socialised behaviours that are shaping our consumption patterns? That's a really good point. The whole debate around plastic bags at shopping centres now is really illustrative of this. Now, I'm from South Australia, where plastic bags at shopping centres have been banned for over 10 years. And frankly, I find debates in the eastern states absolutely mystifying as to why this is a problem. Because commerce has continued unabated in Adelaide without any hassles when people have to bring their own bags to the shops. But it does have a big impact. So what are plastic bags made out of? Yeah, oil. The core input for plastic is oil. And what happens when you throw them away?
Microplastics.
Yeah, they just break down into little bits that end up being ingested by animals throughout the food chain. And what happens when you're a species like humans that eat most of the animals in the food chain? The toxicity comes back to you, but that toxicity spreads throughout ecosystems to doing enormous damage to all of the organisms within those ecosystems. So this complex systems view of life understanding that all species are intimately interconnected with all other species and with the whole ecosystems and geography that we're part of. That's how life works. And we need to bring in this kind of ecological understanding of life into these other human systems. And that comes back to this ontological worldview thing. How do we think of our relationship to all other life? How do we conceptualize our relationship to the earth and to the cosmos around us? This is not an insignificant question. It's the question in environmentalism. And in the politics, this comes right back to what we're doing in this class here. How do you mobilise people around doing something about the sustainability transition? So this is not just the institutionalised politics of governance. This is about you as individuals and how you fit in with other people and how you can have political impact in making this thing happen. How can you pressure governments to act on sustainability transition? How can you pressure businesses in the corporate sector to take this seriously? Yeah.
I was just going to ask, you said before that like environmentalism cuts through the axis of left and right.
Mm-hmm.
Why is it so like right wing to like throw environmentalism under the bus in Australia? Is it like obviously there's like reasons like coal lobbying or whatever, but on like a smaller level, like my dad is quite right wing, doesn't get payoffs from like business lobbyists, but he still doesn't really care about climate change anymore.
Yeah, that's a good question. Part of it, I think, is the culture war. So some thought leaders on the right have very consciously mobilised the environment as an issue around which they can, rally the troops and talk about that as a left-wing conspiracy. But the other thing is sort of core interests. So in this transition process, think of it as the transition process. We're moving from an old way of organising society to a new way of organising society. The vested interests of the old way are going to bite and kick and scratch and defend the system that they benefit from as much as they can. And that's what we can see from the coal lobby and the fossil fuel and mining lobbies in Australia today. And so they have this very strong relationship with this particular faction of politicians on the far right, so Tony Abbott, Dutton, et al. And they're very much mobilising this culture war argument to defend these vested interests of the old economy. So the problem with that is this is a full spectrum global sustainability transition, and they're like a deer standing in front of the road with a whole bunch of semi-trailers hammering at them. Like, they're not ultimately going to stop it because these are larger systemic processes that are happening. So that's why I think like all of this stuff cuts well across the left-right spectrum. I don't know, what's your thoughts on this? Like, you think about your dad, like obviously he's not a bad guy, why is he, what feeds into his lack of environmental concern?
I kind of thought like a cultural thing, especially where if you have some affinity with the political party and they're saying this, then you're going to feel that on some level. But I think like just on like more like a global level, like Donald Trump is like dismantling a lot of environmental policies, and in Europe as well. And like it almost seems like it's on the right wing, it's pushing to even go backwards, rather than like a deer in headlights. Lots of semi-trailers.
Yeah. Or another way to think of it is like a counter-revolution against the future.
Yeah.
But like on an individual level, for someone who's never thought of the environment as something that's important, having to grapple with the environment means putting into question all of the ways that you've been living previously. And I don't know about you, but most people don't like to look at themselves in the mirror in such a critical, reflective way. Like, it's a very confronting process to go through. So I don't blame anyone for finding that process difficult. But in this context, there's so much evidence that this is something that is happening and needs to happen. Really we have to get beyond this. That's why the social movement is important, because the social movement of individuals networked together has these discussions with individual people, spreads the information. It's the glue that binds all of these things together and drives it forward. That's what social movements do. They're the mortar between the bricks of the institutional processes. And this is increasingly happening. The conservative perspective on environmentalism is really interesting. So if you think of conservatism about preserving the status quo, about keeping things as much as possible as they are, and if you look at climate change, for example, climate change is radically reshaping society because of the scale of the ecological harms that it's generating. If you want to keep things as much as possible the way you are, then strong action on climate change would be the way to go. And a number of conservative politicians, particularly from the UK, have made this exact argument. So it is possible to be conservative and still, take on a forward-thinking position on environmental issues. But yeah, email if you want some more info on that. I can hook you up afterwards. How are we going there? Right, maybe this is a good time for a break, I think. So if you want to break for 5 and come back on the hour, and then we'll keep going.